Through an exclusive interview with visual effects supervisor Scott Edelstein from Digital Domain by Screen Rant's own Ash Crossan, we got some new info about No Way Home and how the VFX team over at Digital Domain worked on Spidey's latest adventure. And if you've avoided spoilers this long, here's another warning just in case. Let's start with the bridge scene, because out of all the scenes in the movie, this one is probably the most intensive given what Scott said about it.
We had to build 3 square miles of New York City for that, which had to all be photoreal in the daylight, which is never an easy thing to do. So that was something like 500,000 assets that were instanced around, and at render time, some 30 billion polygons were rendered. So it was a really, really large environment.
Now, 30 billion polygons seems like a lot, but without context, it's kinda hard to grasp, especially when polygon can mean a bunch of different things. The best explanation that I can give is that a polygon, when talking specifically about CG-related work, is a collection of straight edges and vertices which make what is called a face that is usually a triangle but can also be any multi-sided shape that is used to make up the surface of CG assets. So that's like character models and environments. And I promise, that's as technical as this video gets. There's a lot of info on the internet about poly counts and how they should be counted, and because it's the internet and people love to disagree, I couldn't find a definitive way to compare the bridge scene with others, but given that most of my research came up with instances of things being in the low millions, or for less demanding things like graphical scenes found in things like fighting games, which usually hover around the low hundreds of thousands, 30 billion sounds crazy. The amazing part about this scene is that it isn't just a static 3D world or like a matte painting with some effects over it. Scott goes on to talk about how the team also had to build driving simulations and even walking simulations for all the people so that the world around the fight still felt real. He goes on to say though that even during the fight, if it's not a close-up of Alfred Molina's face, he's also entirely CG too, but we'll get more into everything that went into his character a little bit later. But back on the bridge. It's not like the cast didn't have a good reference as to what things would kind of look like. For both the highway fight and the little Spidey Doc Ock interaction under the bridge, there was still a set built out to give both the actors and VFX team a good idea as to how things should look by the end of it. Scott goes into even more detail about the set that was built by saying,
I would say, they built a part of the highway on a back lot in Atlanta, but it wasn't a very big set. You're talking like maybe 200 feet long by 100 feet wide or something, with a few cars on it for Tom Holland and Alfred Molina to interact with. But a lot of the times, that entire world that you're watching is just completely CG. Especially during the fight when Spider-Man is in his Iron Spider costume, and Alfred Molina's not really close. We don't have to keep his face. Just both of those characters and the entire environment is all CG the whole time.
Even though so much of the set design never even made it into the final movie, they still laid the groundwork, literally, for what the world should end up looking like, so shouts out to them too. But even with that in mind, sometimes throughout the process things of course would change. But if you think that they changed some scenes just because of some fan theories, Scott shoots that down by saying,
but I think that's a very fun part of this whole process, is watching the fan feedback and reading the comments online, especially when the trailers come out. And the fan theories and hearing what they think is going on. Like there was that shot. One of the shots that we did was Dr. Octavius getting the nanotech onto his arms, and there was all sort of fan theories about he's absorbing the Stark tech and he's using it for his own thing, and that's going to be so cool. And meanwhile, the whole time we're like, nope, that's not even close to why he's getting like what's happening.
One example that hits on just how detailed and precise everything has to be is when Scott talks about how the bridge fight actually changed because of the direction of the fight being changed. Scott says, and they're like, oh, what we should do is just flip the entire environment and have them going in the other direction. Scott then goes on to say that when you're dealing with something that's fully CG like the fight, it's alright, but when you actually get the actors in, then you have to relight everything. If you watched any VFX artist react videos, you probably know that this isn't as easy as hitting the flip button and everything working out perfectly, especially when you have all those other simulations going on top of the initial footage. Outside of the highway fight, Scott also brings up the changes that both Sandman and Electro went through both during the production phase and how they changed throughout the movie. When talking about Sandman specifically, he said that,
we tried to stay pretty consistent with the old movies, but I would say Sandman, just because he kind of had to evolve from the last movie, he had the most changes. And even throughout the process of us making the film, he started when we first started the movie as a completely different character, like looking character, and then became more and more human as we got towards the end of the film, and then really started to look more like Thomas Hayden Church, kind of like the previous film. But in the beginning, it was going to be much more of like just moving sand all over him and more amorphous, like not really human shaped, and that evolved into what it is. So I think he changed a lot.
When we talk about Sandman a little bit later, him being fully CG is going to be very important, but let's move on to one of the more interesting techniques the folks at Digital Domain had to do for this movie. So while Alfred Molina and Willem Dafoe still look great at 68 and 66 respectively, there's still a big gap of almost 20 years since they were first in the Spider-Verse, so to make their appearances fit more in the world they were ripped from, they had to be de-aged. Scott didn't mention the name, but the actual de-aging process was handled by a different studio other than Domain. But what Domain did was that they took those de-aged CG plates, which is just a fancy word for the shots of those characters, and would composite them into the actual film shots with the characters in them. It's like if you were to take an image, alter it a little bit, and then remap it onto the base image, but with way more VFX know-how than this video can explain. Since the plates were created in a controlled environment and weren't created at the same time of the initial shooting of the movie, Domain had to match the lighting, hair, and other fine details to make sure that it wasn't insanely distracting or felt out of place. What made this part so interesting to me is that I thought it would be similar to a real-time simulation or a deepfake AI-generated plate applied after the fact. Although this decision may have come down to time restraints since the team only worked on the movie for about 9 months, although the previs or pre-visualization process, which is just like storyboarding but with CG, was happening for 2 years prior to the movie even being shot. Alright, now let's talk more about the characters, so let's talk about Doc Ock's best friends. In Spider-Man 2, no, the first one, the tentacles were practical, but in No Way Home, they were entirely CG. But the most interesting thing about the CG tentacles is that even though they weren't practical anymore, the team still made sure to bring in the personality from the practical puppets. So back when they were just practical props, Molina actually named the 4 tentacles, with the top 2 being Flo and Mo and the bottom 2 being Harry and Larry. The top 2 were like the brains of the operation, talking to Doc Ock and advising him, while Harry and Larry did the grunt work like throwing stuff and carrying Otto around. So when it came to recreating them in CG, Scott said that,
and so we actually used that, we color coded them in our animation scenes so that when we were talking to the animators and we were talking to the client about each individual tentacle, we could actually say like, oh, we want Mo to, be more active, or Flo should kind of look at Doc and give him like a nod, that kind of thing.
They also wanted to bring in the same thematic color coding of Otto's tentacles from his original depiction so that you can tell who's in charge throughout the movie. In Otto's big screen debut, there's a sort of language to them, but they also break from it a few times. In No Way Home, they simplified it to make it much easier for the audience to follow. So when Otto is first introduced, the lights on the tentacles are red because he's being controlled by them. When Peter takes over, they turn blue to show that he's in charge. And when the inhibitor is fixed, they turn white so that we know that Otto is now finally back in charge. Those little things, in my opinion, are some of the best uses of VFX because they're subtle, but also carry a narrative purpose in a show but don't tell type of way. When it came to Sandman, Scott says that this was probably the most difficult for a few different reasons. The first reason comes from the fact that he changed a lot during development. Scott talks about how just due to the technical advancement from Spider-Man 3 to now, they had to update the character and goes in depth with the technical hurdles, saying that,
they all have their challenges. I think coming up or, figuring out Sandman, just the technical side of that is hard because he's covered in sand and how much sand's falling off of him, how's he cracking. We had to drive the cracks by his body movement. and drive the falling sand by like where the sand is compressing and cracking, and so how does it fall off?
Which means that for all the scenes where he's standing and talking, for each frame, they had to adjust him to make him feel natural. Luckily, it's not like they had to do that with each individual grain of sand, since that was just a simulation on top of the CG model, and because then the movie would have just never been released. But hand animating and keyframing entire CG bodies is no small feat. Green Goblin and Electro, of course, had some CG elements, like with Goblin's glider and mask or Electro's shiny new star, but it seemed more like those were much easier effects to pull off since they were more contained rather than the entire character shifting around the entire time. So when it comes to Tom Holland's Spider-Man, we already know that during a big fight scene he's CG, but a little tidbit that Scott shares is that once he gets the nanotech back from Doc Ock and Happy's condo,
something that people don't really know would be that in the Happy's condo sequence, once Spider-Man gets the nanotech back from Doc Ock and it kind of creates this hybrid suit that he's wearing, that wasn't originally planned to be that suit. And so from that moment, for the rest of the movie, his body is completely CG.
While it wasn't as difficult as Sandman, the Lizard, or even Doc Ock's tentacles, the standard issues with mixing CG and real shots were still there. Unfortunately, we didn't get much info on the CG process with the other two Spider-Men, but I would assume much of the process was the same, aside from them having their suits be practical costumes instead of CG. Well, at least until they started fighting. When asked about working with future Marvel characters, Scott doesn't say too much, but when he talks about other potential Spider people, he says,
any specific character, I couldn't tell you. I think the Spider-Man universe is fun, and I know that there's a lot more coming with that, so I think that would be fun to be a part of if they introduce more, spider type people. I know that there's like Madam Web out there and things like that, so that would be fun to be a part of.
Now, Dakota Johnson is supposed to play Madam Web in a Sonyverse movie, which could be cool. They somehow made Venom work without Spider-Man around, and I'm always excited for Kraven, so maybe that could be dope. One of the reasons that Scott was such an interesting person to interview was that he's been working with Marvel since the first Thor and has been able to give some insight on how the technology has changed in the last 10 or so years.
Even back on Thor and the first Iron Man, a little bit more limited with what you can do and how you can have the visual effects interact with the people and the characters. But now there's almost no limit, right, to what we're capable of doing given the resources and the time. And so it just really kind of unleashes like all this freedom for them to be creative in any way that they can think of. And it's pretty fun to be involved in that process.
Another thing that he mentions later on in the interview is how Happy's condo was digitally expanded. So because of reshoots, they had to completely redo the interior of the condo in CG. The Goblin Spider-Man fight in the hallway was extended since they had a small set for it, and the lobby scene also had to be recreated for several shots as well. Unfortunately, when asked about what Digital Domain is working on in the more distant future, Scott doesn't give up too much, saying only that,
"No, I don't know what's next. There's so many shows out there, and I'm kind of just trying to take some time off, actually see the family, right? Yeah, and then like Digital Domain's got some stuff in the works that we're still working on." But I am just taking some time off for a minute.
At least this year, we know that they're working on Doctor Strange 2, and given the more out there nature of his character, shout out Steve Ditko, I can't wait to see how much more advanced some of those effects are. Finally, let's talk about the Oscar nom. Now, the MCU has had a lot of nominations over the years, but so far, only Black Panther has brought home anything. This year, the MCU's got 2 visual effects nominations, both for Shang-Chi and No Way Home. Considering we got an interview with one of the nominees, I'm personally rooting for No Way Home. When talking about the lead up to his nom, he said,
I didn't sleep all that night because I was just so nervous about it. And then I figured the next morning when I wake up, depending on how many text messages I have on my phone, that's gonna be how I find out. And so it was real early and just, touch the phone, don't look. And there was 25 text messages. I'm like, okay, that's a good sign.
Thankfully, all of that anxiety wasn't for nothing, and Scott and his team are getting the recognition that they deserve. He also goes on to say just how nice it is to be nominated by your peers, and while the competition is strong this year with Dune and Shang-Chi, I'm definitely holding out hope for Scott to be able to take home the dub. Visual effects is one of my favorite aspects of filmmaking, not just because the VFX artists can do things that you just don't see in real life, but because even little subtle additions or even subtractions when it comes to painting something out can enhance a movie so much.